I've been shopping a little. Let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Please, if you're coming in to join us, please be seated. It's wonderful to have all of you. My name is Frank Hausch. I'm honored to be the chairman of the Buffalo and Erie County Board of Trustees, and we're into year 3, and I think book 10 of the Chairman's Book Club. And today, as all of you know, we will be discussing J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy. I chose this book not just because it was a wonderful book and an important read. It also happens to have been the most checked out book by our patrons in 2017. So this was a book not just of tremendous interest to myself, but also of tremendous interest to the people in Erie County, and I think that they chose very well. Before I introduce our panelists and get started, I want to recognize Burning Books, who has for the second straight time turned up and is selling a number of books, including today's selection, which is now out in paperback. So do as I almost certainly will, and drop a little bit of cash on the Burning Books people, because they've got a wonderful selection of books over there. And before we proceed any further, I want everyone to know that the final 2018 selection, which will be probably in September, maybe October, date and panel to be determined, is The Death and Life of the Great Lakes, Dan Egan's book about the ecology of the Great Lakes and the economies of the Great Lakes. We don't have a copy, but that's what the cover looks like. So please note that will be happening this fall. We have an absolutely wonderful panel to discuss the book today. We will proceed with each of them taking about 10 minutes to talk about their thoughts on the book. And as usual, the balance will be devoted to a discussion. So if you have any questions, please hold them until after the presentation. First, we have Dr. Tamara Alsas, a retired educator from the Buffalo, New York schools, who's held many positions in the fields of bilingual education and bilingual special education. As Director of Multilingual Education, she oversaw the bilingual, ESOL, and world language programs. An active community member, Tamara serves on several not-for-profit boards, including Explore and More, and the National Federation for Just Communities, as well as the Hispanic Heritage Council of Western New York. Dr. Cerny completed his undergraduate work at Macalester College in St. Paul and finished his PhD in physiology in 1976. At that year, he moved to Children's Hospital to establish the Children's Lung Center, and in 1985, he moved to the Department of Physical Therapy and Exercise Science at the University of Buffalo, where he sits as Chair of Physical Therapy, Exercise, and Nutrition Science. Dr. Cerny has been involved in his local community, including as an advisor to church youth groups, a scoutmaster for 12 years, founder of the East Aurora and other locals farmers markets. He completed his Master's in Divinity in 2003 and retired from UB in 2005 to become a full-time pastor. Dr. Cerny currently serves as pastor of Pathways Christian Fellowship and executive director of the Rural Outreach Center, the ROC. The ROC serves the rural poor in southern Western New York with wraparound services out of an office in East Aurora. Finally, Sam McGavern. Last but not least, Mr. McGavern directs the Partnership for the Public Good, a community-based think tank, and teaches at Cornell ILR School and the University of Buffalo School of Law. He's an author whose work includes a nonfiction book, Primo Levi's Universe, a novel, Ooh La La, a movie, The Last Word, and a book of poetry, Noah's Ark. So I hope you will agree we have a tremendous and quite accomplished panel today. Before we begin and we turn the microphone over, would you join me in giving them I will leave it to all of you to decide who wishes to start. Where's the second? Oh, there we go. Looks like you're up.
I guess I'm starting. Good afternoon. Following a discussion that we had as panelists earlier this week with Mary Jean Jakubowski, I continue to think about the book and what I took from it. As I thought about it, the voice of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie kept ringing in my head, a novelist that I admire and was a wonderful storyteller. But in her 2009 TED Talk, she cautions us to recognize the dangers of a single story. She says, show a people as one thing and as only one thing, and that is what they become. If we take J.D. Vance's story as the story of hillbillies and what he calls the white working class, we risk critical misunderstanding. Adichie says that our lives, our cultures are composed of many overlapping stories. Vance, in his introduction, writes, this book is not an academic study, though I will use data, and though I do sometimes rely on academic studies to make a point, my primary aim is not to convince you of a documented problem. My primary aim is to tell a true story about what that problem feels like when you were born with it hanging around your neck. To the best of my recollection, this book is a fully accurate portrait of the world I witnessed. And so that's what it is. It's a story of the world that he witnessed, and not an authority on the experiences of all white working class people and all hillbillies. And most of the story takes place in small town Ohio, not in Appalachia. This is not to say that the book was not a pleasant read. He's a great storyteller, and he writes very engagingly. Some of his stories of his experiences are heart-wrenching. It's when he generalizes his own experiences to all people like him that we risk misunderstanding and stereotyping. Validating the stereotypes that many of us may hold about the poor, the white people, or other people like hillbillies, stereotypes that we might have derived from seeing photographs, such as those taken by the brilliant Milton Rodovan in 1962 in Appalachia, photojournalists, reporters documenting their misery in Appalachia during the War on Poverty, or by watching TV shows such as the Beverly Hillbillies, Petticoat Junction, or some of my favorite movies, the Tammy movies, like Tammy Tell Me True or Tammy and the Millionaire. I have my own single stories of hillbillies in small town Ohio based on my own experiences and my visits to my brother, who relocated to Troy, Ohio, which is right up the road from Middletown. There are many parts of Vance's personal story that really hit home with me, even though my culture, family, and lifestyles were rooted in a completely different experience. I too grew up on what I call the edge of poverty. My father worked as a foreman at Kaufman's Bakery, earned a decent living. His salary was just above the cutoff for most types of financial assistance, and raising 4 children and the occasional cousin or in-law that moved in for a time was not easy. Having come to Buffalo by way of New York City to escape the Trujillo dictatorship in the Dominican Republic and for improving economic opportunities, my parents moved at least 15 times after arriving in the U.S., always trying to move on up and provide us with a better home, a better school. As a child, I moved with them at least 7 times in my K-12 education. As a teen, I was on the fringes of trouble, and I could easily have fulfilled the stereotype of people like me and become a statistic. But luckily, my life took a different direction because, like Vance, I had positive influences in my life too, although my parents valued education like his mother did. I had 2 loving parents, lots of books in our home, and experiences that resulted in my seeing opportunities that many people like me might not have seen. Yet, that is my story. I don't generalize my experience to all first-generation Dominican Americans, all Latinas, all Buffalonians on the west side of Buffalo, or any other group with which I identify. As a teacher and then an administrator in the Buffalo schools, I taught and worked with families of children from all different ethnic, racial, and cultural backgrounds, and within these groups from all different socioeconomic levels. I knew that financial circumstances for them back in their home countries or here were almost all very different, and I couldn't generalize their experiences or make assumptions about the students and their families. As I think about some of the other conclusions and generalizations posited by Vance about his education, I'm reminded of a time that former school board member Carl Palladino, prior to being elected to the board, stood before the board to claim that at least 75% of Buffalo school children came from dysfunctional homes, and he knew this because his sister had been a special education teacher, and had noticed this about her students. His proposed solution to this problem was to take the children away from their parents and put them in a boarding school. He also proposed a site for this school, the former psychiatric center in the H.H. Richardson complex, a scary place with a dreadful history. In many ways, Vance seems to argue that his experience was that of all students like him, while at other times he argues that he was an anomaly, one of the few people to go to college at all, and the only one to end up at an Ivy League school. In many places throughout the book, his arguments seem faulty and misguided. For example, he refers to studies that show that working class whites are the most pessimistic group in America. In searching for data to confirm this, I found studies that contradicted, that say that 76% of Americans do feel that their children will do better than them. Or another study that found that Americans are the most optimistic out of other countries like the United States. Jared Keller, in a 2015 article in The Atlantic, wrote that according to analysis by the Pew Research Center, Americans are far more upbeat than their peers in Germany, the UK, Spain, France, and Japan. Critics argue that Vance, while highly critical of poor whites receiving public assistance, uses his criticism as a way of indicating that all they have to do is work hard and get ahead, pulling themselves up by those proverbial bootstraps. Without explicitly saying so, he's making an indictment of people of color as well. Many examples that Vance cites, he would never understand why his life felt like a struggle, while those living off government largesse enjoyed trinkets that I only dreamed about. Who dreams of being a welfare king or queen? Vance argues that this isn't about race. In the introduction, he says, "I do hope that readers of this book will be able to take from it an appreciation of how class and family affect the poor without filtering their view through a racial prism." Critics argue that you can only view it through a racial prism. Later in the book, he talks about the myths perpetuated about President Obama's birth and says that many of his new friends at Yale blame racism for the perceptions of the president. He claims that Obama is like an alien to Middletonians for reasons that have nothing to do with skin color. Nothing about him bears resemblance to, and he gives reasons for his stance. Obama attended an Ivy League school, he wore suits to work, he's a good father, and although he overcame adversity in his own right, adversity familiar to many of us, that was long before any of us knew him. To me, the argument that his people can't identify with Obama because he's not like them, but that somehow they do identify with billionaire Donald Trump, is ludicrous. As I was revising my remarks and getting ready for today, a story popped up from Huffington Post about a black grad student from Africa whose Yale classmates called the police on her because she dozed off in the common area while working on a paper. The woman said that the same classmate had called police on her friend some months earlier because he was in the stairway and he was black. Despite Vance's laments about his feeling of being an outsider at Yale, I find it hard to completely sympathize because I don't think that he experienced the same type of alienation that students of color might experience in a place like Yale.
It's been about 10 minutes. So.
Okay, I'm going to tie it up then. I read several other articles that criticized a lot of aspects of Vance's arguments. and talked about the dangers of generalizing what he says to the population and to the lessons that people are taking from reading this book. It's not only the most checked out book here, but it's being required as reading in many universities around the country, and I hear that there's even a movie being made of it. In summary, while this memoir contains compelling stories of struggle and triumph of one family in an Ohio town, I worry that it's being used for political reasons. And I'd like to end with what Chimamanda Adichie ended her TED Talk with. When we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to share. So I come out of, excuse me, academia, and I think part of how you look at this book depends on your expectations as you go into it. It's a great read. It's a wonderful story, but as was said, to make any claims beyond that particular story is unfair to both the story and the bigger picture. So as I read it, I looked at the title for starters. It is a memoir, that's true. But then he says it's a culture in crisis. And I thought, well, what culture is he really talking about? Is he talking about the hillbilly culture? Probably not, because they moved out of Kentucky into a middle-class town in Ohio. So he's really not talking about what we might define as hillbilly culture. He's talking about some kind of a syncretism of cultures. So then I kind of read through the book again, thinking, well, all right, what is he really saying about culture and so on? Middletown was a blend. So then I went to the question, what does it take to change a culture? And there's something in psychology called family systems theory. Anybody familiar with family systems theory? Family systems theory says that if you look at families, there are things that travel through families. Divorce, so on and so on, violence, domestic violence, and so on. And it's very, 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 very difficult to change our families of origin and those things that are transferred through generations. And one example that was just highlighted and related to Vance's book in an article in a Christian Science Monitor in their April 2nd issue, where they interviewed a whole bunch of people who came out of poverty but were given full scholarships at Ivy League and other top-class universities. And the difficulties that these people had with good educations, the difficulties that these people had integrating themselves into their new culture. It was very difficult to understand what kind of job they should get. If they went into corporate America, were they dishonoring where they came from? If they went to nonprofit work, were they really taking advantage of the opportunities that were given to them? So this tells me that it's extremely difficult to change a culture. And I think that's really what Vance is talking about, is the difficulty of changing a particular culture, whatever that culture might be. So I want you to just count on your hands and give yourself 1 point if you can answer yes to any of these questions, all right? How many of you have had to go to a creek and get water so you could flush your toilet in the morning? Okay. How many of you tried to get through a Western New York winter in a tent or a camper trailer? How many of you have had to, as a child, stand in a separate line for free or reduced lunch? How many of you have been unable to participate in any extracurricular activity with your peers because you didn't have transportation, to say nothing of money? How many of you experienced maybe all of the above, or at least one of the above, sexual, physical, emotional abuse, and observed someone in your family overdose on heroin? How many of you have gone to bed at night regularly hungry as a child? How many of you have lost a job, a good paying job, because you had one flat tire and you had no resources to get yourself to work? Now I'm going to guess that most people here don't have any ones to answer those questions. But working in our rural area, we're talking Western New York, we have dealt with 2 families who had to send their kids to the creek to get a bucket of water so she could flush a toilet in the morning. We've had people lose their jobs because of one flat tire. And then the spiral continues. Every winter we have people trying to get through the winter in camper trailers or a tent. We had one fellow this winter try to get through it with a teepee. So my point is that you can read about Hillbilly, you can read about Appalachia, but within 20 miles, as a crow flies, of here, all of these things are happening right on our doorstep. Now, here's where this ties into what Vance is saying. When we started the Rural Outreach Center, count on your fingers again, the number of resources that were available to the rural poor in Western New York. 0. We were told, well, they can get to Buffalo and get the resources they need. There are no buses from Holland anymore, Springville, Gowanda, and all of those outlying areas. To the ears of people living out there, that sounds very flippant. Why don't you just get on a bus? I was at a poverty conference in Albany a couple months ago, and they were telling people, they were talking about oral health. Well, we need to make sure our municipalities appropriately fluorinate their water. Are you kidding me? People in the rural areas are drinking well water. There's no fluoride. Oral health is inconceivable to them. So if you want the real story of poverty, you don't read this book. I'm going to recommend 2 other books. One book is called Our Kids, Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis by Robert Putnam. You may recall him from Bowling Alone. And the second one is Worlds Apart, Poverty and Politics in Rural America, because these books tell the real story on a broader sense of poverty in our rural areas. And I'm going to sum it up by saying that it's not an economic issue, it's an opportunity issue. And as Vance says, and this is one place where he gets it right, if we want to solve these issues, it's not going to take government, it's not going to take more money, it's going to take each person here becoming familiar with someone in a rural area that is dealing with this crisis. And then they won't feel so alone.
Thank you. I had a quite similar reaction, I think, to my fellow panelists, that the book was strongest as a memoir and weakest when he attempted to generalize. And I wished he had written an elegy just for his 2 grandparents, because I thought that was by far the strongest part of the book, and their love for him and his love for them was very affecting and made for a great story because they were incredibly interesting characters as well. So similarly, I thought that he got into trouble when he attempted to generalize, and that then he fell into a lot of stereotypical thinking and kind of hazy generalizations that weren't backed by data. So I was also struck by the discussion of public assistance recipients. And before he said the thing about living off the largesse, here's what he said. He referred to someone he called our drug addict neighbor. And he said that that neighbor would buy T-bone steaks every 2 weeks with food stamps. And then he discusses other instances of abuse of food stamps or food stamps fraud. So if you were a casual reader reading that, you might think food stamp fraud was very common and that people get a lot of money in food stamps that they could use to buy steaks. The average food stamp benefit, it's now called SNAP, the average SNAP benefit in the United States is $126 a month for all households. The United Way says that a single person needs $202 a month to survive for food, and a family of 4 needs $612. So the average SNAP benefit isn't even enough for a single person to feed himself for a month, much less a family. So you really can't buy a lot of T-bone steaks with food stamps. Now is there a lot of food stamp fraud? Well, he could easily have looked up the data on that and let people know that food stamp fraud is quite rare. It's 1.5% of food stamp cases. So food stamp serves 44 million people each year in America. It's mostly women and children, and it costs about $70 billion to the federal government. The food stamp fraud rate, 1.5%, so it's about $1 billion in fraud. So I decided to look at another common form of government fraud, which is tax evasion. So tax evasion, unlike food stamp fraud, is mainly perpetrated by people with higher incomes. In fact, the most typical tax evader is a male under the age of 50 in the highest tax bracket with a complicated return. The most common form of evasion is overstating your charitable contribution, and in particular to churches. That's the most common form of tax evasion in the United States. The amount of money it costs the federal government each year is about $500 billion. So food stamp fraud, about $1 billion. Tax evasion, about $500 billion. Which one kind of gets your ire up more and seems like a bigger problem in our country? My second example is dental care. He talks a lot about people's bad teeth, but the only reason he mentions that they have bad teeth is that they drink too much Mountain Dew. Well, the biggest reason people have bad teeth in this country is that 40% of people in this country lack dental insurance. That's by far the biggest reason for bad teeth, not Mountain Dew. Mountain Dew is a problem too. But even if you were just talking about Mountain Dew, you might mention that there's some other reasons that people drink Mountain Dew instead of water or other things, and that one of the reasons is that there's a multi-billion-dollar industry that spends every day, all day, persuading people that it's a good idea to drink Mountain Dew, and all that persuasion can have an effect. My third example is not stereotyping about other people, it's using his own experience and then presenting that as representative. And he does that when he talks about payday loans late in the book, and he says he was working with a Ohio representative who opposed payday loans, opposed regulating payday loans. And he said he really liked that because he once benefited from a payday loan. He, C.D. Vance, got a payday loan and it worked out great for him. And then he says, the lesson, powerful people sometimes do things to help people like me without really understanding people like me. Well, payday loans are illegal in New York State for a very good reason. They don't normally serve people like C.D. Vance. He is not at all a typical case. The average payday loan is $350. The average fee for a payday loan that people pay by the time they're done with it is $450. So the average typical interest rate on a payday loan is 391% APR. That's why they're illegal in New York State. That's why they should be illegal in Ohio. So the fact that he once used a payday loan and it worked out well for him doesn't mean that they're a good idea and that they should be legal. My second main critique of the book is similar to what Frank was mentioning. It's around the question of culture. And as both Frank and Tammy mentioned, what culture is he talking about? So, as they pointed out, he did not grow up as a hillbilly. He grew up in a steel town, actually a city, 50,000 people in Ohio. It actually sounded a lot more like Buffalo than Appalachia to me. It was dominated by a single steel company, and its fate was very much tied to that steel company. He grew up there, his mother grew up there, and his grandparents lived almost their whole life there. So if you go through the book trying to learn about Appalachian culture, you really don't learn much. There's not really anything distinctive about religion or music or stories or anything. And if you think about the kind of cultural keynotes of the book, it's him and his grandmother watching Terminator, and he dedicates the book to his Terminator grandparents. I've actually never seen the Terminator, so I looked up what it was about. You probably all know, it's about a cyborg assassin, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, who kills women named Sarah Connor. So I thought that was really an odd term of praise for one's grandparents. But notwithstanding that, it's really not about Appalachian culture. If you want to read about the history of Appalachia and why his grandparents had to leave and why so many people had to leave, here's another book recommendation. It's called Rampallo. It's a history of Appalachia, but really sets it in the context of world history and of the problems that people have when essentially large moneyed interests cut off people's access to land. So in Appalachia, people once had a lot of access to the woods, and they used the woods to survive. And eventually the real estate speculators and the coal companies took that land away and drove people to work in the coal mines. And then when those jobs were less plentiful, extremely dangerous, dirty, and somewhat better jobs opened up in industrial centers like Middletown, people moved to places like Middletown. So I don't think there's really much about culture of any kind in the book. The culture that the people are experiencing is actually very homogeneous national culture, TV, movies, music that are very much the same around the country. There's an intriguing moment in the book where he reads a book by William Julius Wilson as a young man that's about black inner city Chicago and what happens when the jobs go away. And he says, he was describing my home perfectly. And he thinks about writing to William Julius Wilson. And I thought, I wish you had written him, and he had written back, and your life had taken a different path, and this book had taken a different path, and you had explored how the experience of inner city African Americans in Chicago so closely resembled the experience of you and your family, because it really wasn't about culture. It was about what happens when good paying jobs disappear, and economic segregation drastically increases, which is the theme of our kids, which I also highly recommend. That's what happened to the people in inner city Chicago and the people in Middletown, and they had a lot in common, but he didn't really pursue that insight, unfortunately. One odd thing that struck me kind of the third time I was really going through this book, as I was getting, as you can tell, more and more negative about it, I thought about, well, what does he say that's distinctive about hillbilly culture? And he tells you that to understand him, you have to understand that he's a hillbilly. By the way, I'm part Scottish-Irish as well, and I'm a lawyer and a writer, and he claims that Scottish-Irish culture is very distinctive, and I really disagree with that. I mean, there's so few things about his life and his experiences that someone who was Polish-American or African-American couldn't have had the similar experiences. But anyway, the thing he says that really is distinctive about this hillbilly culture is their fierce loyalty to their families, especially their mothers. That's, if anything, if you did anything, you would defend your mother. And I thought about that, and I thought about the fact that he had just written a best-selling book about how horrible his mother is, and exposing all of her tragedy and all of her life experiences. And I thought, wow, if you are a hillbilly, you're really a bad hillbilly. And I feel bad for your mother. So my last kind of set of thoughts about the book has to do with really the missing context. What you would learn from history, from political science, from anthropology, from sociology, from disciplines that do rely on data and not just on anecdotes. And if you were thinking about those stories and those disciplines, and you thought about Jackson, Kentucky, where his grandparents came from and why they had to leave, it would really be a story about the coal companies and what they did to that region and to that landscape and to those people. Essentially extracting value from the land and from the people, and then throwing both the land and the people away. And then they moved to Middletown, which was dominated by a big steel company. And there, life was somewhat better. And if you think about his family's trajectory, his grandparents kind of made it. Despite sort of disastrous early life, despite getting married as teenagers, making some really bad decisions, having some bad luck, they kind of made it. And why did they make it? Well, they made it essentially because his grandfather had a good paying union job at the factory. The union is kind of the missing civic institution in this book that's never mentioned, but it's why his grandfather had a decent job in Middletown. It's why his grandmother was able to not work, and yet the family could still raise 3 kids who all basically made it. His mother didn't make it because she had an addiction. She had severe mental illness. But the other 3 kids in that family, the other 2 kids both made it into the middle class. his uncle and his aunt. His mother, probably would have, except she had severe mental illness. She had addiction and maybe other issues. And the reason that happened, I think, was because the labor movement made sure that that job at that factory was a decent paying job. The employer, it's interesting, if you look up Armco, they're one of the worst polluters in the country. They have a terrible labor management record, terrible worker health safety record. Mother Jones named them the #1 polluter in the country in 2010. Of the Ohio River is the most polluted river in the country, or at least it was in 2015, according to the EPA. Of the chemicals in the Ohio River, 70% came from that one factory. So I tell you all this to say that even though things were better in Middletown and the grandfather did get a good paying job, it was still an economic model that was really based on extracting resources from nature and from people and then throwing them away, not a sustainable, regenerative, community-driven model. But I think that context is crucial to understanding what happened to the people that he is describing. The rise in economic inequality and economic segregation that Our Kids is about, he does mention it. And he says it was a real problem that people of wealth and people in poverty were living so far away from each other. There wasn't that social capital held in common anymore. But the only reason he gives for why that happened, bizarrely, is he says federal housing policy to encourage home ownership increased economic segregation. Well, if you read the literature on segregation, and there's a lot of it, you really won't find that explanation rising to the top of reasons that we have economic and racial segregation in this country. So again, the missing context leaves you with a very misleading opinion. So I guess the last thing I'll say is that this narrative of crisis is very easy to misuse. And so portraying a culture in crisis, and it's really not clear what the culture is, a family in crisis, even the family, as I pointed out, he made it, his sister made it, his aunt and uncle both made it. The mom is the only one who didn't make it, and she had severe, persistent mental illness, it appears. So what exactly is the crisis? So even the mom, think about her case. Addiction is supposed to be about 50% hereditary. So the fact that her father was addicted to alcohol is a clue that maybe there was a strong hereditary function. He kind of sympathizes with alcoholics and with his grandfather. He's very dismissive of drug addicts and of his mother's drug addiction. She got addicted, he says, through prescription drugs. Well, there's a public policy aspect of that too, isn't there? The power of the big pharmaceutical companies to push pain-killing medication is an important reason that so many people became addicted. Our approach to drug addiction, treating it as a criminal justice problem rather than as a public health problem, the way we treat alcohol, has something to do with his mother's trajectory and with his own attitudes toward her. So even in the case of this very individualized tragedy, there's actually some missing context that might help to explain why his mother didn't do well. Compare again to the grandfather who was addicted to alcohol, but eventually kicked it years later. Maybe she still will. He had a stay-at-home wife who could take care of things, and he had that union job at the factory. She was a nurse without a stay-at-home wife who would pick up the pieces for her. So again, there's a social context to it. Yeah, absolutely. So I'll leave it there. I'll just mention one last kind of chilling part, which is he has an epiphany when he gives a 2-cent eraser to an Iraqi kid. That teaches him that he was actually really lucky and he shouldn't complain about being poor, because here's this Iraqi kid who's so happy to get a 2-cent eraser. There's absolutely no sense of context that our country was destroying his country, and that's maybe part of why he was so glad to get a 2-cent eraser. We were literally erasing much of the economy and the culture of Iraq on, in my opinion, a war that was built on lies and very misplaced policy priorities. No sense of that context. It was a magical moment for him. giving the Iraqi kid the 2-cent eraser. All right. Sorry, I'll stop.
That's all right, thank you, Larry. Would you join me in giving our panelists a very well. We're going to get to questions, and please think about your questions. I'm going to take the microphone around. I would be remiss if no, you keep that one. I would be remiss if I didn't mention, in today's Buffalo News, they had a wonderful article about our reading park, which is coming this summer, right? Right along Broadway. It's a wonderful grant, which was the good people here. I'm taking full credit for it, even though I didn't do anything. Like a good board president, I take full credit for the work that the staff does. But the staff got this wonderful grant from Southwest Airlines. It's going to be wonderful, so please make sure you check that out this summer. So I'm going to turn this over to, by the way, is Ann Conable? Nice hand for Ann. Set all this up. She's going to be the, hold on, I can't. All right, I'm going to need a screwdriver, a blowtorch.
Questions? Anyone?
He talks about, and you hear this often, is he got out, that he was lucky enough to go to the Army, go to Harvard, and get out. And I heard, and it struck me, that the city, the rural America is, to put it in sports terms, is the farm team for the cities. The people who are the most intelligent, the most driven, leave these areas and never come back. I mean, he came back briefly, I believe, and then left again to use his Harvard life. How do we solve it?
First, let me address your assumption. That's not our experience in Western New York. There's no leaving, okay? The poor that we're dealing with in rural Western New York can't leave. They have no opportunities. Look at where the training centers are placed. Look at where all of the resources are placed. They don't have access to anything that would, okay? And they can't afford to move. We're seeing people moving out of Buffalo into the suburban and rural areas because they can't afford to live in Buffalo anymore. 62% of the poverty in Erie County is outside the city of Buffalo. And it's completely ignored. It's called invisible poverty. So again, you know, they're moving, no, they're stuck. They're living in mobile homes that were built to last 15 years and they're now on their 45th year and they're deteriorating around them. There are no federal or local county, local resources available to help people fix up mobile homes. If you have a home, good luck on that one. There's money to help you fix those things up. The deck is stacked against these people. And as Putnam says in Our Kids, it's a matter of opportunity.
I agree with all of that, but the ones who happen to be the kids who go to high school and the exceptional kid who manages to get a scholarship to Penn State or NYU doesn't come back, doesn't add anything to that community. Anything he could have added, he leaves, he escapes, he's not coming back. So they don't have the human capital that could help.
There's nothing for him to come back to.
Yes, I agree.
I guess the only thing I guess I would add to that is just a different aspect of that is that rural counties are losing population across the country. We are continuing to urbanize and we will continue to. It's happening all around the world. The one thing I want to mention about that is I think that phenomenon explains a lot of the nostalgia and the feeling of displacement that is evidenced in this book. It is a loss of the rural life and a feeling of alienation in a big city where the culture is so homogenized and national, and where the relationships are so, there's less sense of kin, and in the urban centers themselves there's much less sense of neighborhood there used to be. So that kind of atomization, I think, is a really important underlying cultural phenomenon that underpins some of the sense of pessimism and some of the sense of alienation and displacement.
he mentions in his book that he went through engineering curricula, and eventually he becomes a financial quant. Do you think that him becoming immersed in the culture of high finance has colored his viewpoint, or has maybe even brainwashed him to make him forget his roots?
Nothing to say?
Well, that's one of the things that's pointed out in the interviews that they did in this Monitor article, is that, so obviously all of this is very complex and you can't take one example, which is the biggest criticism of this book. But they point out people that have gone back to where they came from because they're depressed, because they don't know how to cope with the new environment they've been thrust into. They don't have all the skills, they don't have the networking, and so on. So some people, and he talks about that. He talks about how ill-suited he is for his new environment. Maybe it's a coping mechanism to try to ignore some of those things in your past so you can survive in your new environment. I'm not sure he's just, forgetting it. I think he's pushed it into the background because it doesn't fit his new situation. But it's very difficult, according to these data, to integrate yourself into a different environment. And that's why the family systems theory is so powerful. It's tough to change where people come from.
I guess the thing I'd say about that is, I think that the fact that he is in this world that he's in now, and that he went through the experiences you mentioned, it seems in the book that creates in him this yearning to construct this hillbilly identity that he can then portray himself as somehow honoring and being true to. But that identity construction of sort of this white ethnic identity seems to me like a really bad idea for a lot of different reasons. And one of them I think Tammy mentioned earlier on, which is to sort of get into this business of constructing a white ethnic identity without a really frank discussion of race seems just irresponsible to me, and so lacking in kind of a sense of American history.
Some of the articles that I read talked about the fact that this constructing of this white ethnic identity also separates the people from the rest of the country, as if they're a different America than the America, and that's very dangerous. There was an article by Elizabeth Capt. I didn't read her book, but she wrote a book in response to Hillbilly Elegy called "What You're Getting Wrong About Appalachia," and I read an article and an interview on NPR that she did, where she says that according to Hillbilly Elegy, non-white people, anyone with progressive politics, those who care about the environment, LGBTQ individuals, young folks, and a host of others do not exist in Appalachia. And she adds that if you create and sell a version of Appalachia as a place filled with defective people, then eugenicists pay attention. And she refers to Vance's quoting Charles Murray of the Bell Curve and palling around with him on the lecture circuit, that this identity that really is frankly racist and white supremacist is kind of an undercurrent running through the book.
I don't really have a question, but to the gentleman in the middle from academia, I did answer yes to 2 of the questions that you asked, and I did grow up in a rural area, not too far from here. I received a tremendous amount of help from my extended family members and also from teachers who had a tremendous influence on me. So I just wanted to say that there was someone in this audience who did answer yes to 2 of your questions. And I think the 2 questions that I answered yes to could possibly have been answered by people in any area. So that gives you a clue as to what those questions I answered yes to were. And that's basically all I wanted to say. I did receive a tremendous lately from the education field. There were teachers in my life that I feel if they hadn't been there, I wouldn't have gone to college as I did and ended up with 2 college degrees. But I also credit my parents. I mean, they gave me, even though they had their problems, genetics, you speak to genetics also in your family history, they gave me qualities that were tremendous help to me also. Yes, they had problems, but they gave me my genes and some strength that also helped me do what I did in my life. So that's all.
I also answered yes to some of those questions. And we didn't have to carry water from a field, but when I visited my grandmother in Dominican Republic, we would have to walk across the street, fill up buckets to be able to take a bath and have water to wash the dishes and things like that.
It seems to me that I have not read this book, I will confess that at this point, but much of what I've heard brings to mind, as Sam said, the notion of commonality of experience in terms of various cultural groups. They point to the need for an economic integration rather than a racial or cultural integration, but an economic integration. And I remember having grown up in the African American community in Buffalo, that the neighborhood I grew up in had people who were unemployed and on welfare, as well as people who were doctors, lawyers, and teachers. And what we saw was a little bit of everything. And that cross-section seems to have disappeared. A common problem in inner city communities is lack of transportation to where the jobs are. It's the same problem with rural communities. We need to as a culture, as a country, we need to start thinking about how we integrate all the economic aspects so that we don't have this idea of us versus them, because they have what we don't have. And it gets to a point where that's just so destructive. And identity politics, I know, plays a big role in that, but that's just so destructive.
So, yeah, I think we need to get out of this habit of this dichotomy, economic, cultural. It's far more complex than that. So on one side of the aisle, you hear it's economic, we need to solve the problem with economic policy. On the other side of the aisle, it's cultural, we need to do cultural things. It's both of those things, but it's many more things that interact in ways that we still don't understand completely. So I mean, he kind of makes that point. He says we need to broaden our perspective here rather than zero in on these narrow kinds of things.
One last question in the back, and I have the microphone, so if you could speak up.
Sure. I haven't read the book, but I know that it's been a very popular selection for book choices. Why do you think that is? Do you think that they're reading it with a critical eye so far, or are they getting something else out of this?
It really reads well the first time through. It's very well written, and that blend of a very compelling personal story with some great characters, and then these more general reflections. It's like it's a great recipe for a successful book. And I just wish that the general reflections had been as good as the personal stories.
All right, we're going to stop it there. Could we have one? I have one brief sort of announcement for you before we give one final thanks to our wonderful panel. Tomorrow we have a Talks and Walks program. Tomorrow, May 12th, is the focus on Washington Street. We're going to begin with a panel discussion right here, followed by a guided 1-mile walk exploring the streets connecting the downtown core with the Buffalo Niagara Medical Campus. Starts and ends here. Tomorrow it begins with a discussion by George Grasser, Partners for a Walkable Community, Michael Schmond of Buffalo Place, and Lori Dean Terrell, Just Buffalo Literary Center. So please, tomorrow, please come, tell your friends. It's going to be a wonderful program. And let's give our, yes ma'am. It starts at 10 a.m., goes to noon. Thank you for that question. 10 a.m. to noon tomorrow, right here. Thank you again to our wonderful panel. I thought this was a great discussion. Come back and look for the life and death of the Great Lakes, which we'll be talking about this fall. Thank you all so much for coming.